On behalf of MIT's Department of Economics, welcome to everyone here in the room and also to those of us that are joining in online. I'm going to give a quick introduction to JPAL, and then I'll turn it over to Seema. So my name is Lucia Diaz-Martin, and I'm a policy manager here at JPAL, or the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. For those of you who are less familiar, JPAL was founded here at MIT in 2003. At its core, JPAL is a research center with a network of affiliated professors, 180 affiliated professors based at more than 50 universities around the world. Most of JPAL's affiliated professors are economists, but all are united in their approach of using randomized evaluations to answer critical questions and to test the effectiveness of social policies and poverty alleviation efforts around the world. JPAL's affiliated professors have conducted more than 940 evaluations in over 80 countries around the world, touching on topics like education, health, and also energy and environment. Since 2011, our energy and environment sector has been bringing rigorous randomized evaluations to the field of energy, environment, and climate change policy. We are thrilled that Seema's here to talk to us today about a really important topic, just hot off the heels of the United Nations Climate Change Week, in which deforestation was a critical topic of discussion. As I mentioned, JPAL has an office here at MIT, but we also have offices at leading research universities around the world, including in Chile, France, South Africa, India, and Indonesia. While research is at the heart of what we do, JPAL is about more than just evaluations. We really focus on connecting the dots from research to action. So we do this by drawing out policy insights based on rigorous evidence, identifying critical open questions that still need to be answered, and funding projects that help answer those questions. And we're in touch with sector experts on a range of topics on an almost daily basis. We also provide funding, technical assistance, and capacity building to policymakers in order to support and frame policies and programs that are effective in driving impact. This lecture series, Data Decisions in Public Policy, was launched in 2016 with the goal of showcasing applied economics and highlighting how these approaches can be used to support critical and more effective decisions in the policymaking process. We've had people join in from more than 30 different countries around the world, so thanks once again to everyone here in the room and those of you who are tuning in online. On our streaming platform on JPAL's website, you can submit questions, and we'll try to get to those at the Q&A section, which will be at the conclusion of Seema's discussion. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Seema Jayachandran. Seema is a professor of economics at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on economic issues in developing countries, including environmental conservation, gender equality, labor markets, health, and education. Seema is a recipient of a Sloan Research Fellowship, the National Science Foundation Early Career Development Award, and the Ecological Society of America Sustainability Science Award. She currently serves as a co-editor for the American Economic Journal Applied Economics and an associate editor for the Quarterly Journal of Economics. She is additionally a board member and chair of the gender sector for JPAL and is a co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's program in development economics. In addition, she writes regularly for the New York Times and is a contributor to the Economic View column. Prior to joining Northwestern, she was a faculty member at Stanford University. Seema earned a PhD in economics from Harvard University, a master's degree in physics and philosophy from the University of Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering here at MIT. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Seema. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lucia, for that introduction, and thanks to the MIT Economics Department and JPAL for hosting this series. So today I'm going to talk about, as Lucia said, my role at JPAL is in the gender sector, but today I'm going to talk about another line of my research, which is on environmental conservation. And the title of this talk is related to the idea of thinking about a global marketplace for how should we be mitigating climate change. So I'm going to talk about that kind of at a broad level, and then dive more deeply into a specific JPAL project of mine, which was related to reducing deforestation in Uganda. So just as some motivation, here's a first fact that many of you probably know, which is that rich countries like the United States are the ones who are responsible for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So these bar charts are one way of categorizing countries as how rich they are, and that richest category in yellow that makes up 10% of the world population contributes 36% of CO2 emissions today. Whereas the poorest countries that are the half of the world population, they contribute only 15% of carbon emissions. And that picture is even starker if you thought about the history of historical emissions. So that's the flow in terms of the stock. If over 3/4 of historical emissions come from the countries that are the US and other countries that make up the 10% richest parts of the world. At the same time, almost all of the evidence is pointing to a quite dramatic difference across countries in how they will feel the impacts of climate change, with predictions being that the poor countries will be hardest hit. And that's for a bunch of reasons. One is just geography. A lot of poor countries are in the tropics and start out at hot temperatures. So if climate change is going to lead to increases in global temperatures, with some convex costs for human health or agricultural productivity, if you start out hot, you're going to be harder hit. It's also because people's health is more fragile to begin with in poor countries. If there's 110-degree day, I might be uncomfortable, but I'm probably going to be perfectly fine the next day. Whereas if my health were pretty weak to start out with, which is going to be more true among the global poor, and if I don't have access to great health care, then that's going to lead to serious health problems and mortality. It's also the case that political institutions are more fragile. So there's a lot of evidence that in very hot years, there's political instability in places that have weak institutions or kind of more fragile political equilibria. And so part of the reason climate change could affect countries' well-being, their GDP per capita, their well-being, is through this political channel. And then finally, there's less technical capacity and money to adapt and sort of work around the problems that climate change will bring to people. So that might be less money to turn on the air conditioner on that very hot day, or the resources and technical capacity to build levees to prevent the effects of or reduce the damage from flooding, for example. So here's one way of kind of summarizing how the impact of climate change is predicted to be different in poor and rich countries. So this is a projection from Predis et al. I could take any number of projections or where you would see a similar pattern. So this is looking at when we reach 2-degree warming, what will be the effect on growth in GDP. And the red tones, the red hues are reductions in GDP per capita, and you could see that those are concentrated in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. And you would see the same sort of graph if instead of looking at GDP per capita, you looked at life expectancy or mortality, that we would expect more death and shortage of people's lives being curtailed by climate change in poor countries than rich countries. Okay, so putting this all together, poor countries bear little responsibility for kind of getting us into this mess, and we expect them to be hardest hit by climate change. And in addition, they'd feel the greatest hardship from contributing to this global solution of how we solve this, just because resources are scarcer. So in the U.S. we might have some tough debates about how much we put towards climate change mitigation versus free college for all. In a developing country, that's going to be a decision about, do we give free secondary school to everyone? And so that, I think, putting that together, I think, at least for me, that's a pretty clear moral case that rich countries like the United States, like people in this room, should be shouldering most of the financial burden for mitigating climate change. But what this talk is really about and what I want to pivot to is that we can decouple who pays for mitigation and where that mitigation takes place. Those two things don't have to coincide. And so, we talk often about global problems, and at least within the environmental sphere, I feel like climate change is one of the truly global ones, in the sense that we're quite indifferent about whether we emit a ton of carbon dioxide in Uganda or India or the United States in terms of the impact that will be felt here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so, that means everybody's actions are going to have an impact on us, and our actions are going to have an impact on everyone else. But it also means that when we think about how to solve it, we should be thinking about this global set of opportunities. And so, it means that if you agree with me that rich countries should be shouldering most of the financial responsibility to pay for it, it means we should be looking around the world for mitigation projects and funding the ones that seem most cost effective, wherever those are, not confined to our national borders. And you probably won't be surprised that many of the low-cost opportunities are going to be, or we expect to be, in low and middle income countries. And that's for a couple reasons. So one is about some low-hanging fruit of poorer countries not being on the technological frontier, that there being some things we can do to reduce emissions that are in place in richer countries but not poorer countries. So an example is landfills. Most landfills in the US have steps in place to try to limit methane gas emissions, or technology in place to try to capture and reuse that gas that's emitted. Whereas that technology, it's pretty well defined, it's just not in place, hasn't been deployed in most landfills in poorer countries. But I think there's another and kind of more important one that's important to be quite clear in your head about, which is it's because people are poorer, their opportunity costs for the behavior change that's needed to mitigate climate change, their opportunity costs are going to be lower in absolute terms. And that's precisely because they're poor. So what do I mean by that? If taking public transportation rather than driving to work costs you an extra half an hour, and so you can work a half an hour less a day, if you're making $20 an hour, that means you're going to have $10 less in income. If someone in Bangladesh had that same half an hour loss of work time, and they're making $2 an hour, they're going to lose $1. And so that $1 is lower than the $10. And so an important point is that $1 loss of income might be a much bigger hardship for the Bangladeshi worker than the $10 loss for the person in the US. It might be the difference between being able to feed their kids enough, rather than being able to have a meal outside the home. So it's not that we should care less about the dollar than the $10. It's that if we're thinking about this as in absolute terms, and we want to compensate people for that lost income, that $1 is cheaper than the $10, and we can have 10 times as much activity for the same budget we've allocated to climate change mitigation. So this idea of shopping around the world and thinking about opportunities and funding opportunities beyond your borders is already in place. So since the Kyoto Protocol, there's been something called the Clean Development Mechanism, that would allow the Netherlands to fund methane capture in Honduras. And then since the Paris Agreement, efforts to reduce deforestation, like the one I'm going to talk about, have been brought into this idea of a global market for reducing emissions and meeting national emissions targets. But beyond these treaties, it also just could be a form of bilateral aid. So, for example, Norway, the government of Norway has been one of the big funders of Brazil's efforts, at least under the previous administration, to curb deforestation in the Amazon. Okay, so this isn't just about an arbitrage of finding cheap ways for us as the ones bearing the responsibility to fight climate change. The goal here, or our goal should be, to also make sure these opportunities are win-wins in the sense that the developing countries, or whatever countries the mitigation is taking place in, are not made worse off by this. So many of the efforts to reduce climate change, to reduce carbon emissions, actually do also have local benefits. So for example, if you were building out solar power and displacing coal power, that's not just going to reduce CO2 emissions that have a global benefit, it's also going to reduce particulate matter emissions. And so particulate matter is much more local. This is the kind of, the smog that we breathe in that's bad for our health and is uncomfortable. So that's going to be a quite local benefit. But I think it's also naive to think that many programs are win-wins for everyone. Once we look at an individual level, most programs, most kinds of policies are going to have some people who are made worse off. And so I think an important part of this idea of we're going to go beyond our borders and think about opportunities elsewhere is to make sure there's a do no harm viewpoint in terms of exacerbating poverty and making sure the poor aren't worse off by some of these efforts. Okay, so the rest of the talk I'm going to go into more detail about a specific randomized evaluation that I and collaborators undertook in Uganda. This is the title of the paper we published, which is called Cash for Carbon, and it's evaluating a program that I'll explain in a couple slides called Payments for Ecosystem Services, and it was aimed at reducing deforestation in western Uganda. So this is a Google Earth image of Uganda, and our study area is where the yellow dots are our study villages. And the people in the room at least could probably see that there's darker green in that area. If you had gone back 50, 60 years, there would have been a continuous patch of dark green. So this is a very kind of important area of forest in Uganda that has been slowly, or maybe rapidly, deforested over the last few decades. So right now, Uganda has one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. So the official estimates are something like 2.5% to 3% deforestation per year. So Uganda doesn't have nearly as much area of forest as Brazil or Indonesia, but it's losing it at a very rapid rate. And so part of the reason, besides, our project is framed around, and I'm framing this talk around climate change, but one of the reasons the Ugandan government was especially interested in protecting this forest, and why everybody should care about it, is biodiversity. So the western Uganda is the habitat of chimpanzees, and they're an endangered species, and part of the reason that they're dying off in Uganda is because their habitat is being broken up as the forest is cleared. And so the Ugandan government values that for tourism dollars, and we should all value having chimpanzees and other flora and fauna survive. So this is a project that I should mention has a large set of collaborators, both in Uganda who implemented the program, and then also in terms of the research that was conducted by an international set of researchers, both other social scientists like myself, and then also earth scientists who have expertise in remote sensing, in analyzing satellite imagery, which was an important part of this study. Okay, so this is the one slide reminder, refresher on your primary school science, which is, we all learned that trees and other plants absorb carbon dioxide as they grow. And so when a tree is cut, it's going to stop absorbing carbon dioxide. But the other thing to remember is, where does all that carbon dioxide go that the trees, quote unquote, breathe in? It's all stored in that tree, or most of it is. So that tree trunk is mostly carbon atoms. So in terms of the impact on climate change and putting more carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, the really big upfront impact is because when a tree is cut, that store of carbon is re-emitted into the atmosphere. And sometimes that happens almost instantaneously if it's burned, and then other times, it's decomposing and happens more gradually. It's possible some of it is put in furniture and then it's sequestered for longer. So that's why we care about, that's why there's a link between deforestation. So it's responsible for 10% of the carbon emissions that we're responsible for, where the vast majority of it is fossil fuel emissions, and almost all of the rest is deforestation and land use change. Okay, so today, most of the deforestation is happening in developing countries. And so that's partly because in wealthier countries, the deforestation has already happened. A lot of the lush forests in Europe were deforested in the past. And so when blue ribbon panels run by the IPCC or Nick Stern's committee, when they think about all the opportunities in the world to reduce climate change, one thing that comes at the top of the list, or close to the top of the list, is reducing deforestation in poor countries. And it comes back to this opportunity cost reason, that people are clearing forests for income that's very important to their lives and very important to make sure they're not deprived of. But in absolute terms, that's not very expensive. So when you think at a kind of 30,000 foot level of where do we seem like there'll be some bargain ways to reduce climate change, this comes up on top. That, and just in the context of Uganda, how are people, why are people deforesting? It is these relatively low opportunity cost reasons. So one is to cultivate more land. So they're growing cassava or maize, and mostly for their own family's consumption. And if their family gets bigger or the land fertility, the soil fertility starts to get depleted, they'll cut more forest down to expand their agricultural land. Or the trees themselves are valuable and can be sold. So if you have a big straight tree, you could sell that to a lumber dealer. That's the most valuable use of the trees. Or what's really common in a lot of East Africa is charcoal. So if you take the road from Western Uganda to Kampala, you'll see trucks and trucks of charcoal, because with urbanization and in informal settlements, charcoal is the fuel of use for many people. And so, these trees are important to people. If you have a hospital bill you can't pay, or you have school fees, it's time to pay school fees, you can make $20 to $40 if you have a tree that can be turned into 2x4s. But, as you'll sort of see by the end of this talk, I'll do some cost benefit. If we think about what would be the value in terms of avoiding the damage from climate change worldwide from keeping that same tree intact, it's going to be a lot more than 20 to 40 US dollars. Okay, so this is all an argument for why it feels like there should be a way to sort of outbid this income people are making, or kind of take advantage, reduce this kind of activity. But then it still becomes a question of, okay, how do we do that on the ground? If we want to go from 30,000 feet to the ground, what policies should we put in place to reduce deforestation? So a natural one that's in place for a lot of environmental externalities is to ban an activity that generates a lot of damage to the environment. There are a couple reasons why banning people from clearing the forest on land they own, and I should emphasize that in the context we're looking at in Uganda, this is privately owned land, so people own this forest land, and right now they have the right to cut those trees. The government can still put restrictions on what you can do on your private land, so it could say you're not legally allowed to cut those trees. There are a couple reasons not to. One is, it's often tough to get really strong enforcement of bans. There's not a lot of political will to fine people or punish people. There's scope for corruption. And even if you could, it's not clear we would want to put a financial burden on people by taking away this income. So in other words, if we ban someone from doing something when they're using that money to pay hospital bills or what have you, we're making a pretty tough trade-off and saying we want to protect the environment, but it's at a cost of hurting someone's health or whether they can send their kids to school. And so then a natural alternative approach is, instead of having a stick of punishing people for cutting down their trees, you can give them a carrot and reward them for conservation. And so that's the kind of policy that we evaluated in Uganda, and ecologists call it payments for ecosystem services, or PES. So the payment is because there's some sort of financial payment and incentive, and ecosystem services is a fancy term for a behavior that's doing something good for the environment or the ecosystem. It's providing a service that's in the form of protecting the environment, and so you can be for some specific environmental behavior. It doesn't have to be about deforestation, it's a broader concept, but the form we're going to look at is you own land. If you don't cut your trees, if you keep that forest intact, you're doing something that's good for the environment, and we're going to compensate you as a way of helping you internalize that externality you would be having if you cut down that tree. Or in other words, compensating you for the positive externality you're creating by keeping that carbon sequestered for us. And so deforestation PES programs have been or are being used in many countries. A lot of the big flagship programs are in Latin America, so Costa Rica has a very well-known and expansive program. It's in place in Mexico, Brazil, China, and other countries. I sort of said that there's a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation argument that deforestation should be the low-hanging fruit, and compensating people so they're not made worse off feels like a win-win. But there's still reasons we shouldn't just go and throw money at this and say, this is the solution. It's still an empirical question of whether this will actually be cost effective when you do it in practice. And why is that? The big reason is what economists would call inframarginality, which is the idea that when you make a payment to someone, you're hoping that you have a marginal effect on their behavior. You're changing their behavior. But many of the payments you make might be inframarginal, meaning you're making them and it wasn't changing someone's behavior because they were going to do that anyway. And so in this context, what does that mean? It means that when you pay people for keeping their forest intact, lots of people might have been planning to keep their forest intact anyway. If everybody was cutting down their trees every year, we wouldn't have any forest left. So clearly, some people are keeping their forest intact. And so for those individuals, this is a really great deal. They should be signing up in droves for this program, whereas the people who were intending to deforest and they have to change their behavior, this is a less attractive deal. And so, the idea is this is still voluntary. And so there's a scenario where you could get lots of people to sign up, you pay them money, and all those people you signed up, they were going to have done this anyway. So you paid out a lot of money, but you didn't get any extra forest cover. So ecologists call this additionality, because what we really care about is not how much forest was there afterwards and how much do we pay out. It's how much forest cover did we additionally get because of making the payments. So it's really the separating out, what is this causal effect of this program on forest cover. The second reason that these kind of program might nominally look like it's a success but actually not do much is because there could be what's called leakage, or basically people could be shifting their tree cutting elsewhere. So I could pay you to not cut down your trees on your land. You could go ahead and do that and comply and then just go cut it down on your neighbor's land or steal trees from forest reserves. So in both of these dimensions, our study aimed to try to address these challenges and really measure the impacts inclusive of these two things that could go wrong. And I should mention here that there's a broader concept of leakage that we're not able to get at, but which is important, which is, people might not have had we might have had a real net reduction in cutting trees in Western Uganda, and that means that there was a little bit less charcoal in Kampala or Entebbe, and someone had to do something different as a result. We would love for them to have figured out how to conserve and use energy more efficiently, or to have switched to a cleaner fuel like kerosene. But if they instead imported charcoal from the DRC or something, that might have an even larger carbon footprint. So it's pretty tough in any study to kind of capture all of the ripple effects as people are adjusting when you change one thing. So we're not going to be able to address that broader question, but we are going to be able to address, I think, an important one, which is people just find loopholes and cut elsewhere. Okay, so we did this through a randomized evaluation, which is sort of the bread and butter of JPAL studies, and this was important for this question of additionality. We don't want to just compare people who signed up and people who didn't, because the people who signed up, we would expect those people to have an overrepresentation of people who thought this was free money. They weren't going to clear their forest anyway. And so it's still a voluntary program. People can choose whether to sign up, but what we're using to evaluate it is the fact that it was randomly implemented in just a subset of villages, and so only a subset of people had even the option to sign up for this. And then most of my studies have a very boring picture of randomization of me or RA at a computer. In this case, kind of for transparency, we had a set of public lotteries where government officials chose the treatment villages. And this is a map of we're going to use the Ugandan government's official borders of villages, and that's going to be our unit we're going to look at. It's also the unit of randomization, meaning either a village was offered the program, all forest owners in that village were offered the program, or they weren't. Okay, so there were 60 villages where the program was implemented. So these were families that owned primary forest. They were given the option to sign up for this program if they wanted, and if they did, they would get paid if they kept that forest intact. And then through that randomization, we had 61 villages that didn't have the program, and they're going to be the comparison group. And so we're going to be really looking at how much tree cover was there before the study started, and then 2 years later, after this program had been in place in the treatment villages, what was the change in tree cover, and then how does that compare between the treatment villages and the control villages? And our main outcome is going to be tree cover, which we measure with satellite imagery. So we have high-resolution satellite imagery where you can calculate the area of that polygon of the village that was covered by trees at each moment in time. And then we also did a household survey to measure how did this affect people's economic well-being, what sort of behavior change did they undertake to comply with the requirement to keep the forest intact. And then the last part of the study, and the last part of the talk, I'll talk about the cost-benefit analysis of thinking about, as I said, there's benefits in terms of chimpanzees and to soil fertility locally, but focusing on the carbon, thinking about what were the benefits of that sequestered carbon and how does it compare to the program costs. Okay, so a little bit more detail on the program. So this was funded by the United Nations Environment Program and the Global Environment Facility as a grant to the Ugandan government. And as I mentioned, the Ugandan government was initially interested in trying to protect the chimpanzees, but this is a project that has this additional benefit of sequestering carbon. And then the Ugandan government involved a local nonprofit called Chim Trust to actually design and run the program. And so this was the rough sketch of the program. It's a pretty blunt contract, which is a forest owner, he or she agreed that they wouldn't cut mature trees, which has a specific definition defined by the diameter of breast height. And if they did that, if they complied and didn't cut those trees, they would receive what at the time was 70,000 Ugandan shillings, which was equivalent to $28 per hectare of primary forest they had per year. So the typical forest owner owned 2 hectares of forest, so that means that if all of that land was enrolled, and if they complied, they would receive $56 a year. And the program was in place for 2 years. So each year they would get a cash payment. And so why was the program for 2 years? This was really just it was meant as a pilot. That was what the funders gave funding for, but just in case I forget to say this at the end, part of the cost-benefit findings are this is a kind of program we should be running for perpetuity. I think we often kind of look for solutions where we can do a one-time intervention, but this is an externality. There's probably no one-time solution where we're trying to convince people to care about welfare in the US or Europe, and so what you should think about this is there's a flow benefit to the world every year from keeping that carbon out of the atmosphere. And as long as that flow benefit we're enjoying is bigger than the flow cost of paying people $56 a year, this seems like a good policy to keep in place. Okay, so the Chim Trust ran the program. They held meetings in villages to tell farmers about the forest owners about the program. And then the forest owner and Chim Trust signed a contract, and the reason they had to sign a contract is because the way this was monitored on the ground was Chim Trust would go onto their land to do spot checks, and so it would be trespassing to go onto land without the owner of that land agreeing to it. And that's relevant because some people don't want to sign contracts, as you'll see. So as I said, it's important to keep distinct. We as the researchers, when measuring impacts, we use satellite imagery, but the actual monitoring of whether you complied and deserved the money was done by Chim Trust through boots on the ground. So they had staff members who would go and do spot checks, look for tree stumps or other signs that trees had been dragged or that charcoal had been made. And then they made annual cash payments for the forest owners who complied. Okay, so here's just a picture of our satellite imagery we use in our tree classification, because this is going to be our main measure. I'm not going to go into the details. This is just to give you a flavor of what we did. We purchased high-resolution satellite imagery, which now you can get close to free satellite imagery 5 years later, 6 years later, with the same resolution, which is telling you how quickly technology is improving. But we use this high-resolution satellite imagery, which you could probably see with your own eyes. You can pick out every tree. There are 300 million pixels, so we don't do it by hand. The team at Stanford, led by Eric Lamban, used remote sensing techniques to categorize this image area and whether each pixel was tree covered or not. So we now have a raster of the entire area and can say what was tree cover and what was not. We can overlay those polygons of villages and say, okay, so how much area of tree cover was there in every village? We have that at 2 different points in time. We also did, the bread and butter of household surveys of people, as I mentioned. And then this project had what was new for me, was some field work that kind of involved that technology where we could load up those satellite images on cheap laptops and draw out people's land boundaries in the field. Okay, so here I'm summarizing in one slide our main results, which is what was the change in tree cover between before to after in the treatment villages and the control villages. And so you could see in the control villages, there was a 9.1% reduction in tree cover over 2 years. So that's really rapid. And I should mention the reason tree cover decline is more rapid than forest decline is because the forest defines the perimeter, whereas this is actually looking at thinning of forest too. So in Africa, a lot of the loss of trees is not the clear cutting, it's cutting 5 trees here versus a clump of 5 trees or something. So there was 9.1% reduction. In the treatment villages, there was still a reduction, but it was half as much. And so why wasn't it more? So not everybody signed up, and I'm happy to talk in the Q&A of why that was. It's kind of some interesting economics and puzzles around that. But less than half the people signed up, and so this fact that you got about a 50% reduction in the rate of tree loss means that almost everybody who signed up for the program actually reduced their deforestation and complied. And so this proportional change is equivalent to in each village there being 5.5 extra hectares of tree cover caused by having this program in place. Okay, so there's a puzzle here, which is, I told you not everybody signed up, and there were a bunch of people who conserved anyway. We know that because we can look in the control group, and in the control group there are a bunch of people who don't have much deforestation at all. So there was a scenario where we could have had the exact same sign-up rate, we could have made the exact same payments, and there would have been no additionality. So all the people who signed up were the ones who were going to conserve anyway. And so this is a puzzle for an economist of why weren't the people for whom this was free money, why weren't they signing up in droves? So I don't have a great answer for that. That's one of the puzzles this raises, but it is an interesting, as an economist to realize, what we would consider people not optimizing, people not taking advantage of some loopholes, or not loopholes, they're actually kind of the logic of this contract. People weren't fully exploiting them, and for that reason, that's like part and parcel of why this program was so cost effective in this instance. So we also don't find any evidence of that leakage to neighboring areas. So partly because we're using the entire village, if you shifted land to neighboring neighbors or to forest reserves in your village, we would have be already counting that. And so this is net reductions in deforestation inclusive of any leakage. So it's quite possible that over time, I think there's need for more research to figure out over time, do people start to find those loopholes? Do some of the benefits erode over time for that reason? Also, not just time, but if you scaled this up, then you might start to see, this was too small to affect the price of charcoal. I use that hypothetical example, but if you scaled this up, then the price of charcoal would increase, or the price of lumber would increase. What do people switch to? Does it give more incentive to try to cheat the program or to steal from government forest reserves? And so there's some definitely questions before saying this should be taken worldwide. So just a couple more findings from the survey we did of forest owners. So we find that people say in the treatment villages, people say they cut fewer trees, so that's good. If we had just gotten that, I don't know that we would have found it too reliable, but it lines up with what the satellite imagery says. Some more nuanced findings, we see that people patrolled their land more. So this is an unintended consequence we hadn't thought about, or we had thought about, but it still happened, which is, so there's a provision that you could actually still clear firewood and small trees because it's the richer people in the village who own the forest, so they're still poor compared to me, but they're richer compared to some of their neighbors. And so there was a norm that they would allow their poorer neighbors onto their land to gather firewood, and people stopped doing that, and they started patrolling the land more. So, either they didn't understand there was that provision, or they were just worried about a slippery slope, and they didn't let people onto their land. So in terms of the economic well-being of the participants, we see that it seems to slightly increase, not too much, but we can't reject no improvement, but it looks like there might have been a slight improvement. And in some ways that's good because if they'd become a lot better off economically, this still would have been redistribution from the UN to poor people. But as I said, these aren't the poorest people in the village. So if you had, kind of extra money to give people, not around kind of more, it was more than they needed to change their behavior. And if you had that, rather than giving them extra money as a bonus, probably that money is better spent making some financial transfers to the very poor people in villages who don't own any forests and so therefore aren't eligible for this program. So kind of my advice to people implementing these programs that depend on land ownership is to pair them with cash transfers to people who are too poor to be eligible. Okay, so let me use the last few minutes to talk about the cost-benefit analysis, which is, we have the satellite imagery and regression analysis to measure 5.5 hectares of tree cover per treatment village. Now we're going to convert it to how much carbon dioxide emissions were delayed and what is the value to the world from that. Okay, so that first step, the bottom line is that those 5.5 hectares are equivalent to 3,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide being delayed. And so I'm just going to sketch how we get at this. How do you get at that? So one is the effect size from the regression. And then Global Forest Watch has data on, in different parts of the world, how much carbon is stored in the forest. And so you could overlay our villages and find out how much carbon is there and then convert that from carbon to carbon dioxide. The more involved step is to say, how much should we value that, those 3,000 metric tons? So for each ton, it's worth $1.11. And so how do I get that? So the first is to use what's called the social cost of carbon. So we use the US EPA's data, which is about $40 US. If anybody saw Michael Greenstone's talk here a year ago, they're doing a revision of the social cost of carbon, and I think their final answer is going to be quite a bit higher than $40 US. So that's a value of thinking about all of the global damage in terms of economic damage and mortality from an extra ton of CO2. So that's for permanently averting CO2. In this case, we're not assuming we permanently averted it, because this was a temporary program. After the program ends, people start deforesting again. So we have to make some assumptions about how fast people deforested once the program ended, and how much time there is between when the tree is cut and the CO2 enters the atmosphere, and we use a 3% discount rate. So we can then convert the program cost to the same units, both the payments that went to forest owners and the administrative costs of Chimp Trust to run the program. And in the same units, the costs are 46 cents. So per ton of averted or delayed CO2 emissions, rather, it's 46 cents, and the benefits are $1.11. So the benefits look twice as big as the costs. So this was done, these are the numbers from the published paper where we took a very conservative assumption that after the program ends, the treatment group, they have this backlog of trees, and so they deforest at a really high rate. It turns out that was far too pessimistic. We don't have these results finalized, but it looks like the treatment group is not deforesting any faster than the control group. If anything, they're deforesting at a slightly lower rate, but we can roughly say the same. So if they're deforesting at the same rate, that basically means that you sort of permanently delayed, you pushed to infinity that deforestation that didn't happen during the program, and that makes the benefits of this program 10 times the cost. So it's quite sensitive, it makes a big difference to the cost-benefit analysis. So just to kind of come back to this point that when we're thinking where we should be trying to mitigate climate change, this is my census of all the studies I could find that tried to calculate cost-benefit of climate change CO2 emission policies in the US. And so this is, I should say, and I've switched the unit, so this is cost to benefit, so higher is worse. So in the same units, the program in Uganda is 0.1. And so all of these programs actually look like they have costs that exceed the benefits. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing these things. As I said, the social cost of carbon might be 3 times bigger than we think. There are other benefits like particulate matter. But you can just see that, this gives you some sense that that 0.1 versus something like, 8 to 24 for electric vehicle, there's a big difference between the cost per averted ton or delayed ton of CO2 emissions from this program in Uganda compared to a lot of other options we have in the US. Okay, so to wrap up, I think some of the best opportunities to mitigate climate change are going to be in developing countries, and we should be taking advantage of those. And by taking advantage of those, I don't mean taking advantage of poor countries in a way that makes them worse. I mean, we as rich countries should be footing the bill for that, but not being restricted to our national borders in trying to find how to address this problem. Because for any given budget, our dollars will go further if we think globally. And I think there's a need for more evidence on which kind of policies will reduce climate change most cost effectively. So how much additionality there is in this program or any program like a weatherization program. You can't do it with a engineering calculation, and economic theory is also often doesn't have enough nuance to capture how people actually behave. People behave in surprising ways, and that ends up being really important for the impacts of programs. I think as an economist, I think there's a big role for economists in thinking about ways to mitigate climate change, kind of both my skill set of trying to evaluate programs and making sure they don't do harm to people, they don't exacerbate poverty, that we find ways to make people better off. But also I think there's some interesting mechanism design theory questions related to how to make these contracts longer term. And of course, this project couldn't have been possible if it were just social scientists involved. So, there's definitely a need for other disciplines as well. So let me just close by saying, give you a little preview of a current project I have, which is not around climate change, but is using the same idea of payments for ecosystem services to try to reduce burning of agricultural fields in India. So farmers clear their stubble from their rice by setting fire, and that creates a lot of pollution in Punjab, which is where we're working, and it's also contributes about a quarter of the particulate matter that makes New Delhi a pretty oppressive place every winter. And so the government is interested in exploring different ways to try to get farmers to kind of internalize this pollution externality they're having. And so we're piloting, and I guess next week we're launching surveys to try to see if paying farmers not to burn is a cost-effective way to address this environmental problem. So thank you.
We can go ahead and take questions from the audience now.
Two quick questions. So from this study, are there places where PES tends to be more appropriate and less appropriate to help people think about which context it might be most relevant for? And then second, since it does seem to be so cost effective, have you ever come across an NGO like Give Directly for Trees that could allow people to channel their money towards this sort of thing?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So in terms of where it could work and where it couldn't. So one thing that's unique, that's not true everywhere, which is there's private ownership of forest in this context. So the programs I mentioned in Latin America, some of them there's communal ownership of land, and in that case you could still do PES, but the contract is with a community or a village. And so just kind of like if we think about free riding and group incentives, it's often more challenging to get 100 people to agree to a contract and all agree to do something and split the benefits. And so there is success of PES with that group model, but I think it certainly simplifies things when there's family ownership. And in this case, there's also pretty well-defined property rights. So I alluded to the fact that there wasn't 100% take-up, and even that was around property rights. Like people have very clear de facto property rights, but they still don't have a title. And so I think kind of the more secure people have in their property rights, the easier it is to say, okay, you're the person I'm going to contract with, and if you protect this and therefore the land is more valuable, you also get you retain that value. You can get it if you sold your land or something like that. And then, in terms of like why didn't people shift their land and do the leakage? So I think this is a little bit more subtle, but here people were, I think if you were using your trees build material for your home, you'd have like a pretty strong incentive. It'd be a pretty good substitute to go steal it to go buy it off your neighbor, and you needed something to build your home. But say in like, when you're selling to a timber dealer, there isn't a lot of incentive to go and like buy a tree from your neighbor and then go and sell it to a timber dealer. And so it's also kind of how people are monetizing the trees, whether that's local or outside the community, I think affects kind of how strong the incentives are to try to evade it. Yeah, in terms of, this is a case where I'll be upfront, like it's not that the Ugandan government decided, okay, we're gonna run with this and scale this up. I actually think they probably could have leveraged some of the publicity the study got to have, and we encourage them to, but there have been turnover in the Environment Management Authority. And then Chimp Trust has two parts of what it works on. One is forest conservation, and the other is they run a chimpanzee sanctuary. So Jane Goodall set up a series of primate sanctuaries around Africa, and they run one for chimpanzees. And in some ways, like, that's their bread and butter activity, and so I think they've decided to scale that up. So, I think I think like lots of people have contacted me saying, hey, we are having a wedding, we want to do a carbon offset, we want to give directly for trees. I don't know of one, but I think there would be many people, including myself, who would donate to them if there are some carbon offsets that are about planting trees, but kind of nothing that's I know of that's trying to avert deforestation.
Yeah, maybe you partially already responded to this, but like it seems to me that it's time to move on from conservation and try to talk more about regeneration. And so I'm wondering if you see that there are policies going in this direction. So in this case, it would be not paying for conserving, but paying for reforesting. So paying farmers for reforesting, for instance. And I'm wondering if you've heard about policies on those lines. And because, of course, the cost might increase, but the benefits increase too, and a lot. And I see also that paying for reforestation would reduce some of these ineffective problems that you just raised about, like inframarginality. It wouldn't exist in this case, and many other issues that you just mentioned in the case of paying for conservation. So I'm wondering what are your hints on those topics?
Sure. So the question was about, shouldn't we be focused more on reforestation and planting trees rather than averting deforestation? And I think you're right that the question of inframarginality wouldn't be a big deal because very few people are going to be planting trees absent incentives, and so you're not worried about, you're paying them and they were going to be planting trees anyway. But I think there are several reasons why, and this is sort of less as an economist and more, less my knowledge as an economist and more recounting what ecologists would say, why we should be focused on deforestation, at least two, they're not necessarily substitutes. So one is there are just a bunch of other benefits besides carbon that I mentioned, of like if the primary forest is the home of butterflies and chimpanzees and is a rich ecosystem that it's quite hard to reproduce with tree planting. So, we would love to prevent the problem before it happens where we can, because our substitute to kind of make up for it afterwards is imperfect. There's another one which is related to the time profile of emissions. So I just told you that stalk of tree, that carbon gets emitted, that gets emitted quickly. So if you think about the time profile of carbon dioxide that a tree is absorbing as it's growing, it's going to be much more backloaded, right? Its volume is small, and then as it gets bigger, it's going to have peak absorption of carbon dioxide in 60 years or something. So once we put in a discount factor, the kind of amount of area we would have to plant trees on to have the same NPV, net present value of CO2 compared to deforestation, it's not kind of apples and apples in terms of the area. And then, the final thing is and this will differ by context, but there's a kind of a related question, which is why aren't people in Uganda replanting trees once they cut them? They've realized they can make a lot of money, but most people are not they don't think of themselves as foresters. They don't think of this as like their vocation or their expertise or their occupation, and they don't seem to have much interest in doing that. So you could do that. There are definitely NGOs that are trying to teach people to manage the forest and plant trees and grow trees. But when people have tried out tree planting programs, a lot of people are like, I'm not interested, this is hard, their trees die. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's probably a subset of people who would be really good at planting trees and raising forests. We should find them and we should encourage them to become experts on this. But for other people, for everybody who owns a forest, it requires a lot less expertise to not cut it down, than it is to grow something. And so, I think there are other versions where we kind of rent people's land and plant for them and manage it for them. I guess I'm just saying that, there is something, in some ways you want to, there's something puzzling about why forest owners are not planting on their own, just even for non-carbon reasons. But I just told you could sell the trees for $20 to $40, and I don't think that's I think there's sort of a deep reason, which is this is not their occupation or expertise or their interest.
I think this is a related question to what you were talking about, but I think maybe sort of as a thought experiment, do you have thoughts on what could be modified in the program that you talked about to increase the amount of forest preservation? So kind of building on what you were talking about.
Yeah, so I think the biggest room for improvement would have been a higher take-up in this case. And so this is a good excuse to answer discuss the slide I cut out, which is, take-up, why wasn't take-up 100%? And the reason take-up you should think could have been 100% is it's all option value. You don't get punished if you cut down your tree, so you could sign up and say, hey, maybe these guys are bad at monitoring and they'll pay me, even if I cut down my trees, or I have the option if I change my mind in the future. And so most of the low take-up was really mundane reasons. Forest owners said they didn't know about it or it was a pain to submit their contract. So I think with lots of programs we see, and this is true in the US, that little barriers can deter people, and what we think of as trivial when so much money is on the line can actually be a deterrent. And so I think version 2 would make it much easier to sign up. And then the deeper reasons why people didn't sign up are that they thought it was a ploy to take their land, or they thought, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier, that people have de facto property rights, but not formal property rights. And so someone comes around and says, will you sign this contract over your land? I'm going to give you some money, no strings attached. People have encountered as many people want to cheat them as want to give them, these programs. And so I think figuring out how to strengthen people's property rights with that specific concern is not the case. And then, the other thing that, and this, I don't know how to improve this, but I think this is one of the trickiest, intellectual and practical questions with this, which is, and when I talk about this contract, I said it was kind of blunt, you don't cut trees. Every forester says, oh, that's not an optimal contract. Optimal forest management, sometimes you want to cull some trees because they're blocking the canopy, the canopy is blocking the ground. And an economist could find many ways. If I signed up economists for this program, there would have been no impact because there are just really quite obvious, fun ways to have circumvented it. And so, there's an instinct to make it more complex, but at the same time, the complexity deterred people. And so, you kind of have to balance how do you trade off what feels like it closes down loopholes and is better for the forest with what people will understand, so they'll actually sign up, what they understand so they know how to comply with it, and also for the NGO who's monitoring. If you had optimal forest management where you could cut trees if it was blocking this much sunlight, you'd have to have a very high-skilled team monitoring it to see if people complied. And so, that's not necessarily it's not necessarily a question of how I would improve it, but I think for any program, fine-tuning that and getting it right is, really important and tricky issue.
Thank you. Well, with that, we're out of time. So please join me once again in thanking Seema for joining us today. Thank you.